Today we're going to talk about values and the importance of values in any form of art, drawing, painting, etc. They're probably the most important foundation that we have. They create three-dimensional form, establish light, emotion, mood, can create focal points. They're involved in every part of painting and drawing. And in most cases, when you're a beginner, they are in most cases where you look at a drawing or a painting and you think, look, I've done a great job setting it up and doing it, but unfortunately it just looks a bit bland or there's something wrong. It doesn't have the impact, and the impact is created simply through contrast. There are a few things that you need to perhaps practice to begin developing the values in your work, and also to understand how you can use values and in art, and that's through creating tones from the values that are available to us. One of the understanding values, obviously, and being able to see values is an important aspect of the work that you do. So if you're a good exercise, or an excellent exercise actually, is to create a value scale, I guess. They're also available anywhere on the internet, but it's really important for you to develop your own skills in seeing values. If you just create a couple of long rectangles, as I've just done, and then look at setting up a range of values in there, starting with the middle. So we have, I think, 8 boxes, this being black and this being white. So if we're starting off with a middle value here around 4 or 5 and put in a basic value and then step up into darks and lights. So each step should be progressively darker than the step before. And as you progress, if you squint your eyes, that's going to give you a better understanding of the values that you're creating and how they're changing in between each section. And when you look at what you've done, especially if your eyes are squinted, you should be able to see a transition between each step that is a gradation, that there's actually no apparent big jump from one step to the other, and the same down through working from light or mid value to light and until we get to white. So if you squint your eyes, you should see basically a smooth transition from one dark step to the next. If you start then, and this is the important part of the exercise, I guess, with, say, a lighter value directly behind or beneath the middle value that you started with above, and then from that, again, each step becomes progressively darker. But you'll see, of course, that each step that is progressively darker is lighter than the step above. Again, hopefully in one step quotient at a time. And it's worth practicing this until you get comfortable seeing and applying these values and trying to make sure that you get it so that you get that smooth gradation across that total range. And that's called a value scale. And the important part of that is understanding that these middle values will dictate how high or low key your painting is. So the darker this starting point becomes, then the darker your work will progress to be. The lighter these values are, then the lighter or higher key your work will be. So you can choose to have a very high key painting or a low key painting, very applicable to landscapes and of course, well, anything, including portraits. Now, how do we use and understand this dark value or the value scale that we have here? And that comes back to tones and how we use those values. So there are actually 6 tones. The most important, of course, being the middle value, because that equates to each dark and light process that we step forward. The next one will be the highlight, and I'll explain all this in a moment to you. And then we have a core shadow and a cast shadow, reflected light, and an occlusion, which is probably not as important or used as much in your work as, or it may not have the same amount of importance. But basically, what understanding these tones, which are related to these values, if we just draw a simple circle like that, could be anything. It could be a piece of string on the ground. It has no volume attached to it. Now we can set up a middle value, and as I said above, we can create this to be anything that we want it to be as far as being dark or light is concerned. We just put that over the circle that we drew, and if you have a look at that and hopefully squint your eyes, you'll see that this is probably around about 4.5 on that value scale. Now we have to understand where the light's coming from, and the most important thing that I can tell you is that we do not paint objects, we paint the effect of light on objects, and I'll go into that in more detail again, and it's something that I do stress a lot. And say the light is coming from this direction, because if we wanted to create this as, say, a ball, then as a ball or a sphere, it's going to have a circumference. And basically, as this is the circumference that we can see it on an outer perimeter, the area that's facing us also has a turning point. And that turning point means that this object and the light that is hitting this object, the object is turning away from the light. And as that happens, obviously the light can't travel around corners and it gets progressively darker. And it's not a sudden change to dark, it's a progressive change to dark. And any form that is rounded will always have soft edges as they turn away from the light. If I was, for instance, to draw a brick and the light again was coming from this direction, then this edge, turning point edge, would be a very hard edge, and then slowly gradate lighter and lighter as the ambient light starts to affect the shadow. If I was to draw, say, a pipe or something like that, apart from the fact that it would have a more rounded form, there would be a light gradation getting darker through to the core value and then getting lighter again as it progresses further away from the light, giving a feeling of roundness to the form as compared to the brick. So with our sphere or ball, it has to have a soft edge as it's turning away from the light, and the highlight itself will be at the highest point closest to the light on the surface of that ball. Now even this highlight will have soft edges. If you're drawing an apple or painting an apple, always remember it won't have a hard edge around the highlight, it'll actually be a soft edge. So at the moment we've got a sphere, and so as you can see what was, who knows what, maybe a bit of string or something like that, has now got some volume in it, and this is this core shadow that causes this to happen. And the reason that it actually becomes a core shadow is because it's the object turning away from the light, creating an area where the light can't travel to. So at the moment we've got the ball, or whatever you want to call it, and we have now some volume in it, but it's now floating in air. So to make it fixed or appear fixed, then we can pop in the cast shadow. And cast shadows start darker at the beginning and get darker as they get closer to the object, of course, and slowly get softer edged and lighter as they progress outwards. There's also the ambient light. Light generally isn't focused, it's an ambient light, and the ambient light causes what's called reflected light on the object, which is really an important aspect of doing portraiture, to look at reflected light under chins, under noses, any surface that the light can be bouncing up from to the features in the face. So the light may come down, hit the surface that the object is sitting on, and become reflected light. Now the reflected light is actually not as light as the highlight is, and the reason for that is understanding the difference between light in shadow and light in dark. And I have a photo here, or a drawing at least, that I did, where I have got a specific light side and a specific dark side of the features in that face. all of the lights in that light in the dark side are a lot darker than the lights in the light side, for obvious reasons. Darks obviously in the dark side are darker than the darks in the light side, and that's all stemming back to a middle value. How I'll show you in a moment how I actually created that process of a drawing, specifically featuring a very high contrast dark to light painting. Quickly back to our ball. As you can see, we've got some reflected light now, creating a little bit of interest in our subject. That highlight, I'll make it a bit bigger so it's easier to see, will be lighter than the reflected light. We've now got our middle value, which was what we started with. We've got our highlight, a core shadow, a cast shadow, reflected light, and the last but not least is the occlusion, which is basically if the object is sitting on a table or something, it's where the light just can't possibly get to because the object is completely blocking it. So there are 5 tones, 6 tones at least: middle value, highlight, core shadow, cast shadow, reflected light, occlusion. And of course the middle value is the key to keying your painting either as a dark or a light painting. And all objects that are around it obviously have got a soft edge and have to have a soft edge. In the drawing that I showed you that had a high contrast of dark side and light side, there's a couple of points that I can make in relationship to that. The first being, of course, that if I, and this is often a problem for students, that they have no connection in their values with their subjects. If they are doing a portrait of someone, they'll pop in the darks around the eyes. If they have a dark side and a light side, this might be the dark side with the cheek, maybe the side of the head, side of the nose, and the mouth, underneath the chin, the neck, and exaggerated of course, but you can see it's very bits and pieces here. It doesn't have any feel or connection to it. If I can connect those values, the thing becomes more lifelike and also actually easier to draw. So if I do an outline of a head, at this time I'll start with a middle value. And I re-emphasize that I can choose to have a really light middle value or really dark middle value. It's my choice. Now I'll put in the eye sockets. I'll connect each of the eye sockets with the bridge of the nose, and then of course the shadow side of the nose itself, and the mouth, chin, slightly darker shading around the cheek area, and then the neck. And hopefully you can see that it has that connection of the shadows creates a far more realistic look to it than this does. As rough and as quick as that is, this still has a greater degree of realism. And as with that drawing that I showed you earlier, when you have a pretty strong contrast between light and dark, as I darken this, you'll get a moodier sort of feel to it, and you can create a sad mood, an angry mood, happy mood, with different contrasts available and different values that you might apply to the work that you're doing. So the understanding values and how they can be used is critically important to every aspect of your art. It creates volume in our subjects, it creates mood, it creates connection, it creates realism. You can also use darks and lights to create focal points, and focal points are really important to make in your composition to make something more interesting for the viewer to look at. So in the case of the drawing that I'm showing you now, you can see that I haven't drawn the side of the face in at all. There's no line there because I wanted to give easy access up towards the eyes, and then from the eyes you can see that they're a sort of a shadow step leading down through the nose, down through the mouth, along the chin, and then back out through that open area. Here's the photo of the girl that I drew this from, and you can see that she's got dreadlocks down the left-hand side of her face, and they create a barrier to access to her features. The other part of values is that values create. Line is something else that becomes a focal point, that people will look at line much more than they will at values and shapes, and you can use that to create focal points. So if I have a picture plane like this, and I may have, I don't know, I might have a head in there, and I might have part in dark, part in light, and if I now wanted to create a focal point here, I can actually start to develop a really strong line, and that line is developed through shading. So the shading is what is causing that line to happen. So probably a better example is if I have got my person there and I decide that I want to have a very dark area here, that area is actually now causing a line because of the high contrast between the light and dark. So where I wanted someone to have a look and have my focal point, that's where I would have the strongest dark against the lightest light. As you can see in the painting here of this little boy, around his eye and around his forehead, I wanted to lead your eye in there by having the strongest light against the strongest dark, which also created this line that hopefully will bring the viewer's eye to attention there. The other thing is that if you can draw values rather than lines in your work, especially say with portraiture, then you're going to find that you can make your life a lot easier. And if you have a look at this particular photo here, or this image, you can see that there's not much there giving you much information until I pan out, and then you can see quite clearly that there is now an eye there. And that's simply done through values and understanding the value scales, very carefully observing the values of the subject when I drew that. If you're, for instance, wanting to draw a portrait of someone and you decide, well, I'm going to outline the eyes and then I'll shade them in, and you get a very linear sort of look to it, sometimes a bit harsh, and you're attracting too much attention to an eye area. If you look at using, say, values to do that, and you think about the area between the nose and the eyes, so you might have this sort of a shape of dark, maybe call that a sort of a semicircle of dark. So, and from that then you may have this top lid, and that will be darker again, but it'll be coming out of an already applied dark, and it's a shape, it's not actually a line in this instance. And trying to make sure that I preserve this as a line, as a shape rather than a line. From this area, if the light was coming from this direction, it's slowly going to get lighter as the light traverses across, and then it will start to get darker again. So I may have a shape here that will be a lighter middle value, and then it might be a much lighter middle value where the light was hitting here. I'll outline these shapes in a moment, make it clearer for you to see, and then it will start to get darker again, and there might be now a slightly different shape as it starts to get darker, turning away from the light. It would then have also in the sclera, it would have a slightly different shade, and this will be an oval shape, obviously being an eye. Underneath here we would have, I guess, that pouch you'd call it, the shadow formed underneath the eye itself, again another half moon shape. The iris itself would be a circular form, and the iris obviously a little bit darker, but blending up into that dark iris area, and then the skin fold that may occur would also be there. So the shapes, basically, without drawing lines and just looking at values only, there's this half moon shape here, there's a slightly lighter value here in that shape, this shape here, the darker shape under here, highlight shape here, obviously the darker shape around the iris, and the slight shadow effect under here, and also it would get darker as it gets into the corner and moving further away from the light. Perhaps give you another shape inside that, this larger value here, perhaps another shape sitting in there. So we can use the understanding of values and the shapes that value provide you with to start to create eyes or noses or mouths, because we do not draw or paint objects, we paint and draw the effect of light on objects. And trying to see the shapes when you squint your eyes will give you that opportunity to see the shapes in more detail. So hopefully this has been helpful, and I can't stress enough how important values are. And if you look at your work, anything that you haven't been happy with, you may try and go back and create a better contrast in your work to try and get some impact and contrast that might in fact make your work something you weren't happy with, something you can start to like a bit more. Again, I'll be doing more videos down the track. Hopefully this one was helpful to you, and I'll see you in the future ones.